And now it's time for the rest of the story. In fact, hey, I've got an unanswerable question for my atheist friends. What came first at first life, abiogenesis? The DNA molecule or the code in the DNA molecule to build the first DNA molecule? Now, I'm doing a series, and on the first video I got some good comments, so I'm going to cover the criticisms, and they're good criticisms sometimes, from the atheists. And I hear this one all the time. Since we're talking about DNA, we're talking about information, and so one of the commenters said this, and this is a quote: the word language, and we were talking about how Carl Sagan said that the DNA language was billions of years old. So anyway, so they wrote back and said the word language is used as an analogy for us to relate to the concept of DNA. It's the closest thing we do understand, so we get a clearer picture of how DNA functions. But just because it's like a language does not mean it shares every single trait languages have. So if you read the comments on the previous video, there are basically two approaches. And if you're in, say, Christian apologetics, it'll go this way sometimes. One gentleman, he sticks to fallacy this, fallacy that. It's fallacy this, then ad hominem, fallacy that, and ad hominem. Okay, Mr. Atheist, thanks. I really do. I want to thank you for the vitriol. I really do, because it teaches me how to be more like Jesus. And I appreciate it. I really do, because it helps. It really does. So then even from that gentleman, I got a couple of good comments, and you'll see some of them. What I'm going to focus on, of course, like I try to do, is actual scientific evidence from secular science, and then I'll give a full rebuttal and conclusion. Now, so to start off with, atheists, they really like to use the word analogy, just like in the quote I gave you. So when talking about DNA, they make it so that they build a question in your mind. It's questionable. Is DNA really like, is it really like a language? It is a little bit. I mean, we use it as an analogy. It's a metaphor, and believe it or not, analogy and a metaphor are synonyms. So same thing, and I heard it both ways. Analogy, metaphor, they're synonyms, and they do this all the time. So if DNA only reaches the level of, well, in their minds, the whatever they mean by metaphor or analogy, what does that do for the atheist materialist? Well, it gives them wiggle room. In fact, it gives them wiggle room enough to deny that DNA has anything to do with a language or a computer code, just like you'll see here. This is an actual quote from another atheist I debated. This is his actual quote. DNA doesn't have lines of code. It is nothing like a computer program. There is nothing magical. It is simply chemistry. So he's still stuck on the idea of chemical evolution, which has been debunked since, well, what? Since Watson and Crick found the DNA molecule. Anyway, last time I covered a little bit about Shannon information. And you'll see here in a minute, I'll give you the exact quote from the other atheist who loves ad hominem attacks and claiming I'm, fallacy this, fallacy that, whatever. Normally when atheists bring up fallacies, it's used to shut down the conversation. In fact, I'll tell you what, as many times as I've debated them, what they do first is they bring up the fallacies, and then, of course, it's not affecting me. And I can give it back just as good as they can get. And if you go look at the comments, you'll see that I did. Anyway, I took all of his fallacies, made a list, wrote out the fallacies, what they mean. And that's all I asked him to do. I said, you're the one claiming a fallacy. And then he used, quote, the fallacy of that I said the burden of proof was on him. And he used the fallacy of the burden of proof. And then when I proved to him that he was violating it, anyway, it's funny. I wrote all the fallacies out, and I give a definition. Anyway, talking about Shannon information versus specified complex information. So here was what I wrote, a book. You get the first word, the second word, the first sentence, second sentence, first paragraph, second paragraph, to the end of the chapter. Then you go to the second chapter, third chapter, then the bibliography at the end of the book. And that's how you do it. And then with the illustration that Richard Dawkins gave, you'd have to do that 1,000 times for 1,000 encyclopedias. And then I said that for the very first cell, so that it could replicate, you'd need about 400 million lines of highly complex, specified complex, ordered sequential information. But here's his comment, was this. A rock falls down a hill. Now you have information that does not point to how, who, or what, just an event. What you are doing is speculating that a magic sky bunny, ad hominem, was skipping stones and broke the rock free. It's a funny little story for little minds, ad hominem, that aren't capable of investigating. Sure, there's plenty of information in the rock. Really, there's a lot of information in that rock. But you want to provide a myth story all about it rather than actually look at what is going on. So, question, is the rock rolling down a hill? Is that, what type of information is that? I'm talking about from information theory. Well, my response, can your falling rock generate that much information? Could it build the double helix structure at the microscopic level and then encode all that information into the DNA all at the same time so that the first cell could replicate itself? The answer is a very resounding no. And all I tried to get them to do the first time was, give me a figure. You don't like my figures? Give me a figure. Look at the list that Lee Cronin, a materialist, origin of life scientist who made the list, who said these are the systems you need, these are the biological systems you need in the cell. Give me the amount of DNA it would take to build those systems. Give it to me. And that was my question. And all I got was from the rock falling guy was ad hominem this and accusation that, and anyway. So my other comment to him was, or you actually believe in the Sky Daddy. They like that term, Sky Daddy. I've come to like it too. So I asked him, what's more reasonable to believe? A rock falls down a cliff and builds the first cell, or Sky Daddy Jesus? I like Sky Daddy Jesus. I do. I'm going to use that a lot. How about you? I like Sky Daddy Jesus. I think he did it. Anyway, so how much is DNA like a language or a code, etc.? They never say. They'll never come up with a figure. It was the question that Lee Cronin was talking about in the video. He brought up the list of what you need. Give me a figure. Is DNA like a child drawing it on the blackboard? And this is kind of the impression that I think the atheists would love to push on the public. It's a few letters here and there. That's mostly gibberish. Well, to me, that's not even a good analogy, of the atheist rock perspective. In fact, the little child, at least, it's a little more generous than what they're trying to push. Now, is DNA a few short lines of text, a few short paragraphs, maybe a chapter or two, or maybe one average-sized book, or it's a multi-volume set of highly detailed instructions on how to build actual biological systems? Maybe DNA has a lot in common with a computer code. Maybe it is. Maybe it's not only a computer code, but maybe it involves storage, retrieval, and error correction. So, right now, what I'm going to do is give you several secular scientists on the subject. And then as we go through the video, what I want you to do is try to pick out the description of what they say DNA is made of.
We've shown that DNA is actually the software of life, and you saw some excellent examples of it in the previous talk. And the thing I learned, I know who not to push too far. But chemically, we wrote the genome starting with 4 bottles of chemicals, literally going from the ones and zeros in the computer to writing the 4-letter alphabet, and shown, in fact, that it's totally interchangeable between the digital world and the biological world. We then wrote the entire 1.1 million letters of the genetic code, booted it up, and got a new cell driven totally by the software. So that's what we call synthetic life. We actually use living cells to boot it up, but you change the software and you change the species.
Okay, so the presenter, you change the software and you change the species. The presenter in the video, he likens the 4-letter alphabet of DNA to the ones and zeros of the digital world. And what does he say? Well, he uses the term totally interchangeable. So As it turns out, it's not an analogy, is it? It's not a metaphor. He has programmed. First, he puts the DNA, if you will, the program itself, into his computer, and then he uploads it to a cell, and he makes synthetic life. So sounds like a computer program to me. In fact, it's as precise as a computer software program, at least that much. But we'll see that it's even more than that in a minute. So the presenter, it's kind of interesting. He says, I know who not to push. Well, why does he say that? Why does he kind of look around when he says it? Well, it's because if you get off the plantation in any way, if you try to bring up this type of information about information, you better watch out. Okay, now, some actual quotes from, and I'm going to do this. I know it's the equivocation fallacy, so there you go. I'll give you that one, okay? From Richard Dawkins. And in this particular quote, it proves that it's not just chemistry. That's a total misunderstanding of DNA. And he's standing at his window watching willow tree seeds flying through the air, okay? It's raining instructions out there. It's raining programs. It's raining tree growing, fluff spreading algorithms. This is not a metaphor. He says it's the plain truth. It couldn't be any plainer if it were raining floppy disks, okay? I don't know how much more concise I could be. It's not a metaphor. It's not an analogy. It's the plain truth. And you've got programs, instructions, algorithms, etc. Here, another one, again, from lovely Richard Dawkins. DNA is ROM. Well, my background's in computers. A ROM is read-only memory, and you burn it in one time for the computer. And it stays that way for the life of the computer, just like our DNA does. It gets burned in, as it says here in the particular quote that I've got on the screen. DNA is ROM. It can be read millions of times over, but only written to once. When it is first assembled at the birth of the cell in which it resides, the DNA in the cells of any individual is burned in and is never altered during the individual's lifetime, except, of course, by rare random deterioration. It can be copied, however, it is duplicated every time a cell divides. So, DNA is a biological form, an actual biological form of read-only memory. It's not a metaphor. It is not an analogy to one. It is one, exactly what it is. Now, it used to be that we only used to think of the DNA molecule as the genes, the code. But it's much more than that, if we've just shown you. The DNA molecule is actually ROM, is actually also, if you want to call it that, computer hardware on top of the code. So, quote 3, there's nothing special about the substances from which living things are made. In other words, like the first video in the secular science part of it that I showed you, it talks about 6 simple elements, and then they go on to just throw in the DNA molecule. Okay, they talk about the 6 simple elements to give you the idea that it's simple, and then they throw in the DNA molecule, and it's like, see there? Well, here, living things are collections of molecules like everything else. What is special is that these molecules are put together in much more complicated patterns than the molecules of non-living things. And this putting together is done by what? Following programs. Sets of instructions for how to develop, which the organisms carry around inside themselves. Wow. Programs and sets of instructions added on, a little more complexity for our atheist friends here. And the molecules are polymers. DNA and proteins are polymers. Are they built from the 6 simple elements? Sure. But that's an oversimplification. And again, it's done on purpose. You can believe it if you want to. You can swallow it if you want to. You can. But it takes programs. Who wrote the program? It takes sets of instructions. Who wrote the sets of instructions? In our world, we know that the programs and the instructions come first. Where do they come from? Mind. Why? Because there's specified complexity. Can a rock rolling down a hill do that? Don't think so. There's enough storage capacity in the DNA of a single lily seed or a single salamander sperm to store the Encyclopedia Britannica 60 times over. Some species of the unjustly called primitive amoebas have as much information in their DNA as 1,000 Encyclopedia Britannicas. That was my illustration in the previous video that I shared with the atheist in his comments, and he talked about a rock rolling down the hill. Interesting, though, I have to give Richard Dawkins kudos. Richard Dawkins can see it. Richard Dawkins can talk about it. Richard Dawkins can put it in there. Okay? But atheists of today just refuse to see it. They refuse. It's like, well, I'm sorry, but you got blinders on. You have philosophical blinders on because you want to. Conclusion: DNA is ROM. DNA is actual computer hardware. In fact, it's more than just ROM. It has an error correction system. If you've studied anything about DNA, it has its own error correction system. And it's more than just the code or the language. It has multiple programs, algorithms, and sets of instructions. And also they know that the non-coding regions of the DNA, which they used to call junk DNA, and they had to stop doing that because the, quote, non-coding regions of the DNA act like an operating system, like the Windows operating system. And if you don't know anything about it, you have Windows as your operating system, but all the other programs sit on top of the operating system. And DNA, on top of all of that, is self-replicating. What computer system built at the microscopic level, other than DNA, which Bill Gates called the most sophisticated software program in the universe, can replicate itself? Now, we're coming up with AI systems that I hear are going to be able to do that. Well, wait a minute. Where did the AI come from? Brain. That's where it came from. Funny thing is, really, it's actually vastly more complex than just the genetic code it contains. In other words, let me put it this way. At the beginning of the video here, the atheist, quote, both of them, what were they trying to do? They were trying to knock down DNA. They were trying to give you the impression that it's not really a language. In fact, it's way more than that. It's way more sophisticated, and we've barely scratched the surface of it. The amazing DNA, computer, information, storage and retrieval and error correction system built into one molecule, and we've just scratched the surface on the molecule. That's the truth. Enough said. Have a blessed day.